From Washington to Warsaw, Paris to Ankara, Brussels, Berlin, Bucharest, and Belgrade. Through pandemics and political movements, cooperation and confrontation, digital divides, and defending democracy. The German Marshall Fund is at the pulse of transatlantic relations today, convening the experts and insights needed to navigate tomorrow's world.
Hello, I'm Karen Donfried with the German Marshall Fund. I'm sitting in a rainy Washington and delighted to welcome you all to this book talk with Bob Zoellick. GMF has been doing a book series about the future of American power. And given our focus on strengthening transatlantic cooperation, we are particularly focused on the implications of U.S. foreign policy for our European partners. So I can't think of a more important book for us to be discussing than America in the World, A History of U.S. Diplomacy and Foreign Policy by Robert Zoellick. Bob Zoellick is currently a senior fellow at the Belfer Center at Harvard's Kennedy School. Prior to that, he has had an incredibly impressive career of public service. He has served as Deputy U.S. Secretary of State. He has been U.S. Trade Representative. He also has served as President of the World Bank. And I want to let you know that his book is available for purchase. You can go to Amazon.com or your local bookstore and grab a copy. I know for most folks, this may not be a beach read, but for anyone who's tuning in today, we are part of that foreign policy nerd group that would see a book about American foreign policy as something great to throw in the beach bag and read over summer vacation. It is really a masterful book. It's a sweeping work of history that follows the U.S. foreign policy really from the beginning of the United States up until today. And Bob delineates 5 traditions of American diplomacy that help give us a framework for thinking about America's role in the world. And the way we're going to run the conversation this morning is I'm first going to engage Bob in conversation, and then I'll open it up to all of you. So I do want to encourage you to please go ahead and use the question and answer function in Zoom and go ahead and send in your questions, and I'll try to get to as many of them as I can. And with that, I want to give a very warm welcome to Bob Zoellick. Bob, I am so delighted that GMF is one of the organizations that is helping you launch what is really a masterful book. And I wanted to start by asking you why you decided to write this book.
Well, Karen, first, let me thank you for hosting me, but also, more importantly, for the work that you and all your colleagues do at GMF. Critical not only with the U.S.-German relationship, which I have a particular fondness for, but obviously with Europe and across the world. So thanks for having me and a chance to talk about it. So a number of people on this call may recall that Henry Kissinger wrote a book titled Diplomacy a number of years ago. And I enjoyed the way he used history to talk about diplomacy and foreign policy, but I always had a sense it was written somewhat from a European perspective. So I've been playing with the idea for years, how to use history to talk about some of the American ideas and experience. And the approach, which may make it a little closer to beach reading, is since people like biographies, I focus on people, particular episodes, and the practical work of diplomacy. And I suppose one of the other ideas I had in mind is that for some of us who studied what was once called diplomatic history years ago, that has faded somewhat as a field for some important reasons, because other themes, actors needed to be integrated into the process. But I think we've missed something. Some of the synthesis that was required, or as Fred Logoval at Harvard said, you know, why have we stopped teaching political history? So that was part of my purpose, is to give a little nudge back to diplomatic history. And in particular, insofar as that subject is discussed, tends to be focused on what happens after World War II. And I wanted to also look at the first 150 years of American history, because I think there's some very interesting people and some insights and lessons to draw. And just to give you one little thought, you know, over the past years, America has been used to operating with considerable power in the world. So I noticed when Secretary Mattis stepped down, he said he was surprised the U.S. was no longer having total domain dominance. Well, in much of American history, we didn't have total domain dominance, and there's some lessons to be learned about how a country operates diplomacy without total power, or sometimes in the early years, weakness.
So I will say, Bob, that I'm probably one of those people who is focused too much on the history of U.S. foreign policy since World War II. And I can say that I learned a lot by having you review that earlier history and helping me see the connections across that longer sweep of U.S. history. And for those of you who have joined us, as Bob and I were talking about how to organize today's conversation, we thought that in light of the enormous scope of the book and the many stories and people that Bob looks at, we wanted to focus on one chapter of that story. And that is, perhaps not surprisingly, given that I'm the president of GMF, we wanted to focus on the transatlantic relationship and specifically the US-German relationship and how that story is woven through US history. So, Bob, let's start where you start in the book when you consider Germany. And that really is the US-German relationship with Imperial Germany, or with the Kaiser. And just take us through that period of history, through Woodrow Wilson's presidency and World War I. So, Bob, over to you.
So to set a little context, and one of the things I try to do in the book is internationalize the context for US action. Recall that our Civil War from 1861 to 65, which was critical not only in preserving the Union, but creating the Union in a stronger United States as a potential player on the world stage. This occurs about the same time as the wars of German unification, so 1864 to 1871. So you have two rising powers on the world stage, and inevitably they're going to interconnect. And some of their first interconnections are actually in distant places. So in the Spanish-American War in 1898, after Commodore Dewey destroys the Spanish fleet in Manila Bay, the United States has to face the question, what are we going to do? Are we going to occupy Manila, all the Philippines? And one important factor was that the German fleet was hovering, and there was a serious concern that the Germans would occupy the Philippines if the United States didn't assume some control. At the same time, that war was, of course, fought first over the Spanish control of Cuba. America committed itself to Cuban independence, but Cuba was within, and some would argue over history, still within the American security space. And so there was something called the Platt Amendment. The Platt Amendment allowed the US to intervene in Cuban affairs in extreme circumstances. And Elihu Root, who was the Secretary of War, later Secretary of State, I write about him and his role in international law, explains later, he said, you cannot understand the Platt Amendment unless you understand Kaiser Wilhelm. Now, what's that about? Well, it's important to remember that Imperial Germany, or frankly, France and others, in this age, with some developing countries in Latin America, if they didn't pay their debts, they would come and occupy the country. That sort of happened with Mexico in our Civil War and Venezuela. So those are some of the first interactions. But then there's a period of interesting cooperation under Teddy Roosevelt. So my focus on Teddy Roosevelt is not him as charging up San Juan Hill or the Great White Fleet. It's him as the mediator. And he wins the Nobel Peace Prize for the mediation of the Russo-Japanese War, 1904, 1905. Well, at first, the Germans are quite pleased that the Russians are having a difficult time with the Japanese because Russia was France's ally. But then the Kaiser gets worried with the revolts and the revolutionary spirit in Russia in 1905 that they're going to overthrow the Tsar. And that doesn't look too good to a fellow emperor. So Roosevelt quite shrewdly brings the Kaiser in to put some pressure on the Tsar to try to reach that mediation. But the second mediation, which I also discuss in the book and is really sort of lost to the mists of history, is called the First Moroccan Crisis. This is 1905, 1906. And for those of us part of the community here, there's a special tie because the German ambassador of the United States, Emily Haber, did her dissertation on the second Moroccan crisis. So it just shows the relevance of history. But this crisis starts when the Kaiser gives a speech off Morocco, and he's basically challenging the French domination of Morocco. And it leads to a fall of the French premier. It challenges what is the emerging French-British Entente. Russia's absorbed in war. And it might have seemed like a distant conflict, but recall the World War I starts on the periphery of Europe, where a conflict in a distant place sort of leads to a conflagration. And that's how Teddy Roosevelt sees it. He recognizes he's trying to mediate balance of power. And frankly, he's worried that France will be humiliated. But Germany isn't quite sure of its posture. And the Kaiser actually approaches Morocco as an open door issue, an American principle with China. So he tries to bring the United States in as a mediator. And there's this wonderful little moment where the German ambassador to the United States, Sternberg, who respects Roosevelt, has a very good relationship, pleads with Roosevelt to mediate, and actually exceeds his instructions and says, look, if we reach a point where we can't agree, the Kaiser will accept the US position. That really wasn't what he was supposed to do, but Roosevelt, as an efficient politician, pockets it and later uses that to force an accord. And because he threatens to publish the papers of the negotiation when the Germans are holding off to reach a result, and thereby embarrass Germany with the American public. So that's an era where Roosevelt's trying to manage the balance of power, understand great power competition, but avoid conflict. Well, a few years later, we have 1914 and 1917. And that's an interesting account because Wilson, President Woodrow Wilson, is trying desperately to avoid entering the war. He has to deal with what the public has called a dual wish. On the one hand, they do not want this war. We don't get involved for almost 3 years. On the other hand, the German U-boats are sinking ships, Americans are dying, the principle of neutrality is threatened. And so how does he try to struggle with that issue? And I touch on another episode that Phil Zellico will talk about more in a book that he's publishing next year, which is the tempting idea of whether Wilson could have mediated peace in 1916. And just think of how the world would have been different if you didn't have the devastation of 1917 and 18. The Germans reach out to Wilson. He first has to get reelected, so it's a short span sort of near the end of the year of 1916. And the point of this story is that Wilson's failure at what I'll call the operational art of diplomacy. He doesn't really know how to test this idea. The Germans are pointing out ideas. We could evacuate Belgium. There's ideas about Alsace-Lorraine, creating independent Poland. Wilson goes and publicly says, give me your war demands. Well, no politician can give the minimum because they'll be thrown out of office. If they give the maximum, nothing happens. Wilson gets no help from Colonel House or the Secretary of State. And so the opportunity, which I explore more in the book and Phil will explore further, that historians will debate, but it looks like there was some possibility here that if you'd gotten private assurances and the parties to sit down, the publics would have never accepted war again. But instead, the German military decide they've got enough U-boats, they can try to shut off the Atlantic. And we have the wonderful story of the Zimmerman telegram, where the Germans propose to our Mexican neighbors, if you join us in war with the United States, maybe even bring in the Japanese, we'll give you Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico. As I say, I don't know what they wanted to do with California, since that had been sort of Mexican too. And that really sets off the sort of the final stages to war. So, part of the story here is two big powers coming on the world stage and their interaction.
It's, I think all of these stories are illuminating when you put them all together. And I'm happy you mentioned the European crisis in Morocco, because as I was reading that part of the book, it also showed me the enduring nature of Franco-German relations and the complexity there, the role of Britain. And you see that in all of these different vignettes. that you capture in the book. So Bob, that gives us some of the early history. You've divided the book into 5 parts. The 4th part of the book is entitled A New Order of American Alliances. And in that part of the book, you tell the fascinating story of the development of America's new alliance system in 1947 to 1949. And of course, as president of GMF, I love this section of the book. And you remind us of the decisions that led to the rejection of Washington's and Jefferson's cautions about alliances with European powers. And the U.S. ultimately builds an unprecedented alliance network. And to date, we've made an enormous investment in this entangling transatlantic partnership. So I want to take you from that early history to this period of post-World War II, 1947, 1949, and this fundamental change about alliances.
So the wonderful part of this is that the story of the creation of the Federal Republic of Germany is inextricably connected with the development of America's post-war policy. And that development was not planned, as you know. It's a response to a series of events. In the spirit of trying to draw out some key characters, I retrieved Lucius Clay, which will be known to a German audience in particular. But he plays a key figure, and he's in some ways the typical practical American sort of on the scene. He's quite worried from the start that Germany will fragment into unstable domains on half rations. And his frustrations are as much with the French as with the Soviets, because they're basically draining the country. And what he says is, look, if we continue in this policy, the United States will have to have huge aid to support the Germans so that they don't die off. And we'll probably have to garrison the state for a long period of time. It's not an effective way to sort of create a democracy. And this is in George Marshall's mind when he goes to Moscow for this critical conference in 1947 in March, where Marshall recognizes the limits of negotiation with the Soviet Union, because he comes away with the sense that Stalin wants Europe to remain in turmoil because he thinks it will serve the Soviet Union's interests. And so, as you know, with the story of the Marshall Plan, coming back from that trip, George Marshall believes he needs to try to do something, not actually a military alliance, but the idea of a political or important sort of economic relationship to put Western Europe on its feet. And that leads to the next issue, which is that when they look at the nature of European economy, it doesn't work without Germany. Germany is so key to coal and iron and other aspects. So he takes what was Bisonia, the aspects of Germany that was from Britain and America, convinces the French to join in, and it starts to create the basis for the Republic, the Federal Republic of Germany. This then creates a response that leads, on the Soviets' part, the Berlin blockade. And of course, that's a wonderful story. You know, we often look upon this as a case of American ingenuity and technological capacity. In fact, as it starts out, as Ben Steele points out in his book, the airlift was a temporary expedient. People didn't expect it to work. But this Air Force general, who was a logistics master, Major General Tuner, sort of makes it work. And then there's a key development on the German side. The Berliners are a key part of this story, and they remain a key part of this story at other parts, because all of a sudden, within 3 years of the defeat of Nazi Germany, Berlin is Freedom City. These people are standing on the front line, and you can't sort of abandon them. However, having taken this step, then you have the question of a military alliance, both to deal with the Soviets, but also, frankly, to reassure the French and others in Europe that if you're going to recreate a German economy, what threat will it pose to them? They've already been down this road twice before. So in some ways then, as you know, the Marshall Plan, in a sense, is the foundation of European integration with Germany, as well as kind of the basis for NATO. And I think one key point here is to see how the pieces kind of come together, not as a planned program. And at this point now, Germany, for those of us who speak a little German, Germany is the Schwerpunkt. Germany is the central point of this story.
And I remember you have a line in that section where you also say the origins of American strategy toward Germany for a half century traced to the decisions of 1948. So it's fundamental for everything that follows. And Bob, I'd like you to talk also about the creation of NATO and how that military piece accompanied the economic piece. If the Marshall Plan was about helping Europe to recover economically, then the role that NATO played on the security side. But I also want to pick up on your point about Berlin, because you do see going forward the importance of Berlin in the Cold War story. So maybe fill in the NATO piece and then use Berlin as the bridge to take us to JFK and the Berlin crises in the early 60s.
So on the NATO piece, one point that I try to emphasize in the book, and you alluded to this, is for 150 years, America's avoiding alliances because of the warnings of Washington and Jefferson. When it does come up with alliance system, it's a different idea of alliance. It's not primarily a military alliance. And the person who articulates this in some ways best is Senator Vandenberg. Now, I draw out the role of Senator Vandenberg to show the role of Congress over time. But Vandenberg explains this is primarily a political alliance. It's primarily a diplomatic alliance that, of course, develops a military capacity. And the integrated military command is the ability for the Bundeswehr to restore its role when Germany rejoins or joins NATO in 1955. The unique nature of an alliance system runs throughout the question of the Cold War, and I would argue is an issue today. What are the nature of that sort of unusual partnerships? But you mentioned Kennedy, and my chapter on Kennedy focuses on his style of crisis management. And Berlin is a key piece of this because he learns a lot from Berlin, but it's also a test of the alliance commitment. So yes, we make these security alliances, but are we willing to go to war for Berlin? Or as I talk about in the following chapter, what's our commitment to Vietnam? How far do these relationships extend? And Berlin is such a powerful case because it's the first attempt to try to use the blunt threat of war among nuclear powers. That is a very scary topic. So Kennedy starts out with some stumbles. There's the Bay of Pigs with Cuba, which was not a crisis that turned out so well. He goes to Vienna, where Khrushchev, as he freely admits, kind of browbeats them. So by late 1961, he's got this challenge in Berlin because East Germans are pouring through the border. And the East German communist government is worried they can't support the system. Their solution is a wall. Kennedy's first response is a wall is a hell of a lot better than a war. But he fails to appreciate the symbolic importance of what this means to Berliners and Germans. And I include a couple stories. In fact, there's a role of a woman correspondent, Marguerite Higgins, who's well respected, comes to see Kennedy and does something that, as you know, is extremely valuable for presidents, which is she tells him straight and honest. She said, look, the Berliners and everybody thinks you're going to sell out Germany. And so what JFK thinks has been successful management, he now realizes that the air can go out of the balloon. Will Germany turn neutral? What does this do to American security commitments? So Lucius Clay comes back in the picture. And Lucius Clay believes that the concerns about escalation have been overstated. And he comes up with a very interesting observation, which is, look, there's a difference between what the East Germans are trying to do and the Soviets. And in part, his Soviet counterpart, like him, was a World War II general. And I think that Clay recognizes, look, do the Soviets really want to hand over the nuclear sort of button and control to the East German regime, or do they want to sort of manage this situation? This leads to the famous showdown in October at Checkpoint Charlie. And that's a dramatic moment because many of Kennedy's advisors are not trusting Clay. They think this is another Douglas MacArthur who played Truman in Korea. But JFK works with Clay, and Clay, I think, quite skillfully sort of manages to draw a line without going over the line. Always a big challenge in diplomacy. Kennedy, like many presidents, doesn't like to lose. I think he backs Clay, but Clay pays a price. So one of the other lessons that James Baker, my boss for 8 years, told me is you never win a war with the White House staff, and this costs Clay. But in 1962, the Kennedy team, somewhat understandably, but they're still worried about the miscalculations of nuclear war. So they keep proposing things to the Soviets about Germany that I refer to as smorgasbord diplomacy. They're giving away too much until the Germans say, we're quite worried about this. There's a leak from Germany. And then now the American public come back into the picture. And the American public think, why are we conceding this? So they send all these black umbrellas to the White House, reminding Kennedy about the appeasement under Chamberlain. And of course, his father was associated with that. So, so the White House pulls back. Then we get to the Cuban Missile Crisis in October '62. And what I draw in the book, others, Zellick and May have talked about this, is I think it's pretty clear that the Cuban Missile Crisis, which once was viewed as an independent event, is critically connected to Berlin. And the brief part of it is that Khrushchev is actually planning to present a fait accompli of nuclear missiles in Cuba, create a crisis in Berlin, go to the UN and say, here's the compromise, which was sort of to neutralize the system. So the people in Berlin clearly understand the Cuban Missile Crisis is partly about them. And by now, Kennedy, to his credit, is quite successful at managing the internal debate, remaining in control, having public support, having off-ramps, a kind of signaling, and he's quite an effective crisis manager. And then the culmination for me of this story is Kennedy's visit to Berlin in 1963, which is the prominent, Ich bin ein Berliner speech. Because at that moment, Kennedy, who was a cool customer, starts to recognize Berliners as a people, kind of as opposed to a bargaining chip. And he recognizes more than his staff that Berlin is an asset. It's the outpost of freedom. And now this is partly the German story. It stands for kind of the critical dividing line in the Cold War. And so rather than being a liability, it's a plus for the struggle of Europe. And so in a way, one can conclude from 62 or 63 is that the line that the Cold War will be debated and fought over is in Berlin. It's not on the Elbe, it's not on the Rhine, it's not on the Channel. And of course, that leads us to the events of 1989.
Well, and that's a perfect segue. And I'm going to ask you one last question, and then we've got a wonderful set of questions that have come in that I want to turn to from our audience. But yes, that takes us to 1989. There's also another connection that you draw very well in the book that you see during JFK's time, which is the tension among policymakers about whether to concentrate on Moscow or whether to make U.S. allies the strategic priority. And the same tension is there in 1989, the end of the Cold War, German unification. So yes, bring us to 1989, because this is the period of history that you yourself contributed to in such an important way. So Bob, please.
Well, your point is the key one. If you go back, and Marshall makes this point, the American spirit is to try to work out a problem. So at first with the Soviets, they're trying to reach some accommodation. But Marshall and Atchison and that group very strongly believe, look, we have to secure our alliance partners. We have to put the alliance relationship first. And as you mentioned, I think one of the differences eventually between Kennedy and his team is his team is willing maybe to sell out some of the German interests because understandably this is the era where you're trying to avoid nuclear exchange, but they go too far. And part of the story is actually on the practice of diplomacy. Timing is important. When to move, sometimes when to know, when not to negotiate with yourself. And that does come back in the 1989 period. And so for people who recall this debate, you'll still hear people will say, oh, the Cold War was over by 1988. And this would be the Thatcher view. George Shultz has made this point, some of the people around Reagan, because they're focusing on the Gorbachev relationship. What was important to understand in early 1989 was to Bush and Baker, the Cold War would not be over until the cause of the Cold War, the division of Germany and the division of Europe, was dealt with. So hence the phrase a Europe whole and free. That's the strategic origin of that. And as you know, they had a challenge, because coming off of the intermediate range missiles removal, so the 00, the only nuclear missiles left in Europe were the short range nuclear missiles. And as one German political leader said, the shorter the missiles, the deader the Germans. So coming in 89, the prominent issue was NATO wanted to modernize these missiles. The Germans said, look, we want to negotiate them. This created the worry, would you have a nuclear detachment if they were sort of negotiated to 0, which had been what Thatcher and others were worried about. So President Bush in May of 89 comes up with a proposal that, again, it's been lost to most historians, but it's the focus of my chapter on this, which is this Conventional Forces Initiative, which says, look, let's lower to equal levels. That will have the effect of making nuclear missiles much less important. It establishes Bush as a leader in the alliance. It gives Gorbachev something to start to sort of reduce costs. It certainly sends an important signal to Eastern Europeans about these forces leaving, and it makes it harder for them to return. So that's all accomplished at this NATO summit in May of '89. That's also where then the trip where Bush gives the speech in Mainz about the partners in leadership. So at heart, he's looking at the German question as being as significant as the Russian question. And this is, to me, quite intriguing, in part, I think, because it turned out pretty quickly and quickly well. People don't recognize the question of a big united Germany in Europe was a big topic for people, both East and West, and certainly sort of historically. And the Bush-Baker judgment was, look, we need to put allies first. It goes back to this Atchison question, or the question that JFK came to. And I think there was also a logic to this related to Gorbachev, which was to be effective in dealing with Eastern Europe, to be effective in dealing with Gorbachev, to be effective with European integration or NATO's role, we have to get things set up at home first. And I mean, and just to give you a crude analogy today, as people think about China, you know, my starting point would be our alliance relations. Not only our Pacific ones now, by the way, the European relations would be sort of quite important with that. So I guess the way that I look upon all these periods, Karen, is, you know, many of us have kind of grew up thinking about Germany in the Cold War development, understandably, because of the creation of the Federal Republic of Germany and the Marshall Plan and others. But what I hope my history will point out is Germany is at the heart of Europe. It's at the heart of Europe geographically, economically, politically, in security terms. And so the lesson that I would draw over 150 years is that it remains quite important for the United States to have a good partnership with Germany as part of a European and transatlantic structure. And it's certainly very foolish to undermine the relations, particularly after the types of partnership we created through the unification process. So it's not to say that things will always be smooth. If you read my history, there are big differences and conflicts about these issues. But you have to listen, you have to respect the other side, you have to try to work through some of these issues together. And frankly, I think both US and German and European policy will be stronger if we do that.
Well, you referenced China in that comment that you just made, and I'm turning to many of the questions that have come in, and there are a few around China. We have one from Maya Chen about how you see the Trump administration's tough China policy and the current tensions between the US and China. And I want to connect that with a question from Uwe Wissenbach, who references the fact that you coined the objective of getting China to become a responsible stakeholder of the international community, and you talk about that in your book as well. And then he says, while China isn't there yet, isn't it now the United States that is no longer a responsible stakeholder, wrecking multilateralism? So maybe you could respond to both of those questions.
Yeah, well, to start with the last point, I think that's a very fair point. We'll talk a little bit more about China, but if we think about this alliance system you and I talked about, not just the military side, the political, the economic, and the skill that people like Bush or Baker or others had over the years, we're throwing that away. We're deconstructing that system. And obviously this has huge costs for not only us, but for the world. So maybe some of those experiences I draw from the first 150 years will be relevant again if we don't or at least how can they complement the alliance system? But to take China, and since the spirit of at least my book and the discussion is to put things in a historical context, I also have a number of chapters on China. And I guess I would draw attention to three themes that draw out of the American historical experience with China. One is the commercial dream. So Mike Green talks about this in his book, and I emphasize it. Sort of the Empress of China is a ship that sails in 1784 with ginseng from Appalachia. It has a huge profit. So America has always looked upon China as the commercial dream. Now that light is often just shining over the horizon. The China market doesn't quite bear out. Although, to be fair, China was the largest source of growing market for U.S. exports for 15 years prior to the Trump administration. So there was a lot that was accomplished. Second, however, in a way, thinking like Germany, how does China fit within an international system? Well, during the Boxer Rebellion period, again, people often don't pay attention to this, but the Europeans had just carved up Africa in the late 19th century. There was a movement to do something similar in China, but also then involving the Japanese. So the US policy of the open border was not only trade, it was to try to preserve the territorial integrity of China, realizing that China is a unit. Ella Heroot, this Secretary of War and State, says a breakup of China would be akin to the breakup of the Roman Empire. Then in the 1920s, what I talk about the Washington Naval Conference in East Asian security is, can you create a basis for a Republican China to start to get its economic legs and feet going forward? In World War II, FDR looks upon China as sort of a potential partner for the post-war order. Under Nixon and Kissinger, they bring China back in the negotiation. And again, my idea with the responsible stakeholder was, by 2005, when I gave the speech, China was already integrated into the system. The question was, would it act responsibly as a partner? So I didn't say China was a responsible stakeholder. I said that the United States should press China to assume some of these responsibilities. But the third theme I want to emphasize is, from the very start, and this shows America's transnational spirit, the United States has a missionary attitude towards China. And indeed, direct missionaries. The Christian missionary movement is huge in China. It affects the creation of the novels. Pearl Buck was from a missionary family that wrote The Good Earth. It's a lot of our famous diplomats come from that experience. Literature sort of buoys. And whether it's Christianity or small r republicanism or capitalism, we've been trying to convert China for 150 years. And what you see happen is, when the Chinese all of a sudden resist and decide to act like Chinese as opposed to junior Americans, Americans react with extreme hostility. You see it in 1949, 1989, you're seeing it today. It's almost the sense of rejection that one has in the relationship. So my starting point is, let's be practical and understand China as it is, not necessarily China as we dream it to be. That doesn't mean you don't work with China in the system. So to come back to the responsible stakeholder idea, my thesis, again, a lot of this book is about pragmatism and results, is that how can you press China with allies, with forces within China, to be more responsible? And one of the things I think has been left out of the current debate is what actually was accomplished through that cooperation. There's an assumption, if you listen to the current administration, that it was all a failure. Nothing was done. There's an article I wrote for the National Interest in March and April this year that has a long litany of things that were accomplished. But frankly, if you take, say, nuclear and missile proliferation policy, in the 70s and even through the 80s, China was one of the worst sort of problems of that. China moves to become quite cooperative on these issues, and frankly, helping with North Korea and Iran and others. Through the UN Security Council, often with negotiations. I think it was out of 186 out of 190 sort of resolutions, we managed to bring the Chinese on board. The work that I did in Darfur in the early 2000s, trying to end the genocide, I got the Chinese to be quite cooperative in that process. If you think about the economic side, China no longer manipulates its exchange rate. It was the fasting source of global growth. It was a very good partner in the global financial crisis. Its current account surplus goes from 10 to 0, adding sort of global demand. I mentioned the expansion of U.S. exports. This is not to say that everything is fine, but it's to say the work of diplomacy sort of never goes away. Even take Taiwan, which is in the news today. So if you go back and you look at the exchanges of Nixon and Kissinger with the Chinese in 1971, 72, you could see that the Chinese might have expected a different position of Taiwan today than it's turned out to be. And so we've been able to successfully create an autonomous space for Taiwan to be a democracy. In my own case, I helped bring Taiwan as well as China into APEC in 91, 92. I was able to bring Taiwan into the WTO in 2001 and actually got China as part of the World Health Organization as an observer. So part of the question here is not that all is well with China, and I think the Xi Jinping regime, actually going back to the Cold War, is still shadowed by the fall of the Soviet Union. And I could share some stories about that. It's for us, it's a historical event. For Xi Jinping, that's a threat that they still face in the Communist Party. So what I come back to is, look, your policy, in my mind, has to be based on results, not just kind of what verbal bombs you can throw over. And whether it's environmental issues today, like climate or pandemic issues or economic issues, you're going to have to figure out some way to work with China. And that doesn't mean, for example, on Hong Kong, what I think the U.S. response would be like Britain's. Say, if you want to send a message about different ideologies, let people from Hong Kong come to the United States. So why don't we do that as opposed to just sanctioning people and having fewer conversations? I'll connect this back with Germany and Europe, though, because I think, as I alluded to, this is going to be a long-term challenge. And the United States not only needs to work with our Asian allies, but on a number of these topics, we need to find some common ground with our European allies, because for the longer term, it's a question of, can we put pressure on China to restrain aggressive behavior, but also to try to encourage more responsible behavior?
And time is racing. I'm going to slip in one last question because it's directly connected to this, Bob, connecting China to the transatlantic relationship. And this is from Bill Drozdiak. It seems clear that public sentiment in the United States has swung in favor of concentrating on rebuilding America rather than expanding America's footprint abroad. Is this the time to call for a new Atlantic Charter that would bestow greater responsibilities on our European allies to take care of their backyard while we focus on the China threat? Or would such an initiative inadvertently accelerate an American withdrawal from Europe and its leadership of NATO?
So, Bill, I approach this a little differently. And I understand why people like to come up with charters or frameworks because it sort of symbolizes the action. But if you get a chance to read the book, you'll see a lot of my story. And even the 4749 story comes out of the realities of working with problems on the ground. So I was mentioning to Karen before we began, I think you're right. The U.S., if Biden's elected, he's going to have a huge agenda, pandemic response, frayed healthcare system, inclusive economic recovery, racism, environment and sort of climate change, immigration. And for people who know the American political system, there's only so much you can get done, particularly given our system of government. I think Biden could be quite skillful at that, working with Congress. That's he could be more prepared than anybody since LBJ with Congress. But nevertheless, his team will have to be quite disciplined about priorities. What does that leave for the international side? I'm sure many foreign policy people have a very long agenda, but I would suggest thinking about how you could leverage those changes. So if you're doing something on immigration, connect it to your Mexico policy, where Mexico is going to have difficulty. If we're doing something more effectively with the pandemic, not only rejoin the WHO, but perhaps have an initiative like Bush 43 had with the HIV/AIDS in Africa. If you're going to do something on climate change, then bring it not only back to Paris, but come up with some initiatives to bring in developing countries on soil carbon or avoided forestation or technology efficiencies for sort of developing countries. There's a huge set of opportunities. And what I would then do is that I would make that my agenda with my European partners or my Australian and Asian partners. So I'd be building from the bottom up. So for people who know Europe, those sort of topics, plus added some security questions about proliferation, would actually create the foundation for building a new transatlantic relationship, whether you call it a charter or not. And that is important for the bigger question, which will what's the future of free societies and how together will we deal with China? So I don't start with the the negotiating the charter, let's start with the practical events across substantive topics and build cooperation, which is what happened in 47, 49.
That is a great note for us to end on, because it really is an agenda for action going forward. And apologies to all of the other wonderful questions that were sent in. I hope this encourages all of you who haven't yet read Bob's book to do so. As you can tell from this conversation, it's just a wonderful review that actually is inspiring in terms of thinking about U.S. foreign policy going forward. As I mentioned at the beginning, this is part of an ongoing book series. I just want to highlight that the next book talk will be with Suzanne Nussel on her book, Dare to Speak, Defending Free Speech for All, and that will be on August 19th. I hope you can join us then. But what I want to ask you to do now is join me in giving virtual applause to Bob Zoellick, both for writing this book that will stimulate our thinking and stimulate conversation, but also for spending this time with us this morning to share your thoughts with us. So Bob, a big thank you.
Well, thank you, Karen. Thank you for having me, and thanks for everybody who joined us on a dreary day here in Washington.
Good day to curl up in a chair and read a book. So thank you, and thanks to all of you who tuned in for this book talk with Bob Zoellick.
And it could be good on the beach because of these stories.
Okay, thanks so much, and bye-bye to everybody.
Bye now.